Good morning. Thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming to this panel this morning to talk about America's security strategy and the challenges that this administration faces, that we face as a nation after we try to sort of rebuild our international standing after 8 years of so-called leading from behind under the Obama administration. After 8 years of this policy, it's no surprise that President Trump's inbox in tray was very full January of 2017. Whether it's restoring American credibility in the Middle East, in Latin America, or Eastern Europe, or picking up the pieces of a failed Obama foreign policy with Iran, with Russia, rebuilding U.S.-Israeli relations, this administration has its work cut out for it, and so far it's doing a great job and heading in the right direction. On the issue of credibility, I wanted to share a personal anecdote of an experience I had back in 2009. I was in the Middle East. I was traveling with a British delegation, and I kept my mouth shut so no one knew I was an American. And we were meeting with a crown prince of a Gulf state, and he said, you know, if President Obama is willing to throw Poland and the Czech Republic under the bus when he canceled the missile defense site, if you remember that, if he's willing to throw these two NATO allies under the bus to have better relations with Russia, then why wouldn't he throw us, the Gulf states, under the bus to have better relations with Iran? And this was in 2009 when he said this, and how true was that statement? And that's why decisions taken by the Trump administration, for example, arming the Ukrainians or arming the Georgians, send the right message to friend and foe alike. And in a way, this is the America First foreign policy. America First isn't America alone, like the critics and the haters want to say. But America First is about putting our friends and partners and allies first before dealing with adversaries. And that, I think, marks a pronounced change between the previous administration and this administration. And I'm very proud, and I can speak on behalf of my colleagues here on the stage, to be part of an organization like the Heritage Foundation, which has played such an important role in delivering some of these outcomes, on whether it's U.S. engagement with China, decertifying the Iran deal, remaining committed to Afghanistan, supporting a U.S.-UK free trade agreement after the Brexit process finalizes. Heritage has played a leading role, has been a leading voice, not only with the administration, but across the conservative movement, not only in America, but in many cases around the world. And it's great to be part of that. Now, having a sound foreign policy and getting American credibility restored and getting our international standing where it should be only gets you so far. And the important thing, the foundation on which all of this is built, is having a capable armed forces, having young men and women trained that know how to use the equipment, that can deploy, know how to operate, and have the intelligence community and the capabilities and the assets there to support them. And that's why it's my pleasure and honor to introduce our two panelists this morning, two very distinguished panelists. Immediately to my left, Dakota Wood. Dakota is our senior research fellow for defense programs. He had a very distinguished and gallant career in the U.S. Marine Corps for 2 decades, served in places like East Asia, West Africa, the Middle East, the Balkans, the Mediterranean Sea. After leaving the Marine Corps, he has had a successful career working at very high levels in government and NGOs, think tanks, advising at the strategic level. And Dakota is probably best known at Heritage for his Index of Military Strength, which he edits, which I saw some copies out there. It's a fantastic document. I highly recommend you pick up a copy. And then David Shedd is our distinguished non-resident fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Distinguished, I was stressed distinguished. 33 years of U.S. government service that peaked as the acting director of Defense Intelligence Agency, and before that, serving 4 years as the deputy director of the Defense Intelligence Agency. And before that, a very long and distinguished career working in CIA, the NSC, different embassies around the world. And now in all of his spare time after leaving the government 33 years, he advises various boards, works with various charities, and is an independent security consultant, which I think in Washington we call all that stuff retirement. But he'll offer a unique insight in the intelligence community and the challenges that we face. So after that, we'll have some time for some questions. So now I will turn over the discussion to Dakota.
Thanks, Luke. Appreciate that. Luke didn't talk about himself, but running by, 2/3 of the world, I guess, and regional coverage, Latin America, Africa, Middle East, et cetera. So it's great to have him moderating this panel. As Luke had indicated, we can have foreign policies, but if you can't back that up with something, it's just a lot of words, right? So there's this rhetoric-reality gap that Washington, D.C. never seems to really acknowledge. And so what we've tried to do here at the Heritage Foundation is put some truth behind the reality of American military power. You know, what does that really mean in practice, and how did we get to where we're at? And if we are not in the right place, what is the challenge moving forward in getting to where you would want to be? Everything's dollars driven, you know, it's taxpayer monies. Obviously, a lot of the budget is on debt, which means that our children are going to be paying tax dollars for forever. But we didn't get into our current plight overnight. It certainly hasn't been since the Budget Control Act of 2011. This is actually a situation that I'll illustrate with some slides. You know, being a Marine, I got to use PowerPoint, right? Otherwise, I lose my card. But picture really is worth a million words, and so I'm hoping the graphics kind of illustrate this stuff. So what you'll see is a situation that has really been in evolution or development for 25 years since the end of the Cold War. So if you remember, the Clinton administration didn't spend a whole lot of anything on defense, and so we had this procurement holiday, a period of almost 10 years where we didn't really buy new stuff. So if you've got a car and you're driving it, you know, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of miles, and you delay maintenance and you delay replacing that, don't be surprised if you have a large maintenance bill or replacement cost years down the road. And that's really where we're at today. And so all of our figures are really based on our assessment of what the United States needs. And you would see this in our military index. But we adopt this policy that the United States wants to be a great friend if you want more people on your team than on your opponents. And if you want to deter opportunism by your competitors, then you have to be seen as credible and capable in more than one region. You know, if we're dealing with Asia Pacific and China, the Middle East and Iran, if you're dealing with Europe and Russia, if you only have the ability to deal with one region, it creates opportunities for mischief in all the other regions. And our competitors look at us and they can count ships and tanks just as well as we can. So this idea that you've got the capacity to handle two major wars doesn't mean you want to do two wars, but it deters people because they know that you can handle one and you still have stuff left over to handle something else somewhere else. That also gives you the ability on a sustained basis to rotate forces in and out of theaters. If you've got sustained operations in Iraq, for example, the people you send over don't stay there for forever. You bring them home, you send over replacements. You need a rotational base. You need the ability to give people rest so they can go to education opportunities, take care of their families, serve in jobs outside of the operating forces. So this capacity is a really big issue, literally and figuratively, but it takes money and it takes equipment and it takes resources to be able to do that. So those numbers in the red boxes, we've assessed it based on historical norms where the Army takes about 21 brigades to go to war, and that's Korea, Vietnam, Desert Storm, Operation Iraqi Freedom. If you wanted twice that capacity, that's 42. We added in a 20% buffer for all the training and education and transition types of things that occur, and so that's how we get to that number of 50. So if you look across those columns, it's basically the same argument. How many airplanes, fighters does the Air Force need? How many battalions in the Marine Corps? What you see in the green columns is what we actually have. So within the Army, they've got 31 brigades. In 2012, they had 45. They had 45 brigades trying to build a 48. just to handle sustained operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. Budget Control Act came in, budgets were slashed, reduced from 45 to 31. Any guesses on how long it takes to rebuild a brigade combat team? 2.5 years. So if you wanted to rebuild combat power today, you wouldn't have operational, competent, effective Army brigades for 2.5 years or more. You got to recruit. You've heard recruiting numbers, how much of the population in that recruiting age is even eligible for service. It's about 30% of American youth. Of that, how many people would actually want to join? So when we start taking cuts or you don't buy things, it takes a long time to recover. You got 31, how many of them are actually ready? Well, when we put together this last year's assessment, only about 10 of those were assessed as ready, and only 3 of them could be deployed on a moment's notice. Now, what the Army has done is they said we put a lot of time and effort into increasing readiness. They say about half of their force is actually ready, so we're assessing about 15 on that. And so how things have changed over time is the services have put a lot of effort to try to get flight hour programs, the number of times a pilot gets into a plane and flying. In some areas, they've been flying a lot, but if you're flying at 30,000 feet in Syria and dropping a guided munition on a Toyota pickup truck, that's a different kind of flying than flying against counter-air, surface-to-air missile systems, the kind of combat flying you'd have to do against a competitor like a China or Russia. They have not been doing that kind of training. So statistics can be misleading when a big official comes out and says, we're doing a lot better, look at our numbers. You have to see what's behind those numbers, and that's what we try to do. Secretary Mattis has been all over the map in a good way about prioritizing current readiness. He knows the budget problems coming out of Congress. He says, if I've got this smaller force, roughly 2/3 of what we need, at least it has to be ready. And so his priority with the plus up in funding for this year and next is to increase munitions inventories, try to get broken equipment repaired. Current readiness is what he's looking at, but sacrificing long-term modernization. And you've also heard news reports about DoD officials being less forthcoming in their testimony and public statements about the current status of our armed forces. On the one hand, that's good, per their argument that you wouldn't want Russia or China to know where you might be vulnerable or have weaknesses. On the other hand, the American public doesn't know anyway, or either. So if you want to increase your defense budget, well, what's the rationale? If everything is good and we're perfectly capable of going off to war, why do we need to increase spending? What we suspect is the conditions had actually gotten so bad that it would be demoralizing and kind of scary to be very upfront with the conditions of some of our capabilities. And so when they've defended the budget in detail, they usually do it in closed sessions there in Congress instead of public testimony, and it makes our then reporting to you and to others a bit more problematic. As we go forward then, I mentioned some of these procurement holiday things, and these are just a couple of really quick slides to show when you have a gap. Prior to 1992, U.S. Air Force, our air power component, purchased on average about 500 airplanes a year. Now that was everything, little things, big tankers, cargo aircraft, fighters, et cetera. After 1992, the average has been less than 100, about 92 airplanes. So if you're flying at high rates, old equipment is being worn out, and you actually have to park it, you're not reintroducing new equipment to replace that, which means the overall size of the force shrinks, not as many opportunities for pilots to fly, and it just becomes problematic. And if you don't buy anything for about an 8-year gap, at some point, that deficit of buying new stuff catches up to you 20 years later, which is where we're at today. So again, it's another cost that comes along. On the ground equipment side, you can see that the Abrams main battle tank was introduced in the 1980s during the Reagan buildup. The Army has said on public record that we'll have that tank until the year 2050. 2050. So it'll be a 70-year tank. And when I was discussing this with Luke, he said, you know what that means? That means the driver for that tank, usually a 20-year-old, 22-year-old, won't be born until the year 2030. So think about that the people who will be the last crews for those pieces of equipment haven't even been born yet. All right, so that kind of puts things into context. So they're going to try to extend this out to about 2050. For the Marine Corps side, their AAV, I think the graphic is a little bit misplaced here. It was actually introduced in the 1970s, 1972. They plan to have this until the year 2035. So it's older equipment, you update guns and optics and communications gear, but at some point the basic vehicle itself, the ship or the airplane, just becomes aged and it's not keeping pace with what the competitors are bringing in over the last couple of decades. When you talk about bow waves in terms of procurement costs, over the next 10 years or so, we'll have about $700 billion worth of new equipment that need to come in. A ballistic missile submarine can only dive and surface so many times before the hull becomes fragile. The reactors inside use up their reactive core material and have to be replaced at a particular point in time. So there's only so far that you can extend these things. Airplanes, the actual spars and members inside the airframe start to become brittle, they become worn out, stressed on all that. And the cost of rebuilding that thing, you might as well buy a new airplane. So we have these programs that are out there, like the F-35, the replacement for the Minuteman-III intercontinental ballistic missile, the B-21, which is the new bomber that will be coming online in the next decade. So all of these costs are coming down the pike, and yet we've been underfunding defense for a couple of decades. And when I get to the last side, it'll be a jaw dropper in terms of how you all have been tracking national debt, national deficit spending, and how this accumulates to a point where you just don't have the wherewithal, if you're going to fund social programs and not raise taxes, to fund the military that is the backstop for our foreign policy types of things. Where we're at today is we had a 2-year bipartisan budget agreement to briefly increase defense spending quite a bit. That's the purple lines there in the middle. Nearly $700 billion this year in 2018, and upwards of $716 for 2019. But when that agreement expires, funding will drop $80 billion a year back to Budget Control Act levels in the year 2020. That's the same year where we'll have to debate increasing the debt ceiling for national spending. It's the same year for a general election presidential cycle. So what do you think the likelihood is of having discussions about reducing domestic and entitlement spending to fund defense? So Adam Smith, who's the ranking member, House Armed Services Committee, has already been very pointed in talking to the service chiefs of get ready for tighter budgets in the years ahead. The 4 service chiefs, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, and the Secretary of Defense, are already telegraphing what problems we might encounter in 2020 and beyond if sustained levels of spending aren't provided. So when somebody gives you money and it's only good for a year, how do I buy an aircraft carrier that takes 4 years to build, right? So it's the type of money, the context in which that money is given that allows you to recruit and train soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines, take the equipment out there that's actually modern, that can compete against what China and Russia are bringing to bear, and then the troops have confidence and competence and going out and actually doing the tasks that they've been called upon to do. On this slide here, this shows you where our budget projections are at. This year, we're running about an $850 billion budget deficit, spending more than what the country is taking in. Next year, the CBO, Congressional Budget Office, estimates that that deficit, annual deficit, will be near $1 trillion just in those 2 years. That gray part that you see at the top is spending on entitlement programs, mandatory spending. The orange is interest on the national debt. So as you increase debt, you all are business folks know that the interest payment also increases, and we've had essentially free money for several years. So if the interest rates go up to 3%, 4%, 5%, that orange will dramatically expand, and it tends to squeeze out discretionary spending like defense. So the projections really aren't happy ones. And the final slide here is to show you what the rest of the world is doing. China has increased its spending since the early 90s by 650%. They've got their second aircraft carrier out in the water, domestically produced. Their third one, which would be a conventional flat-top carrier, nuclear-powered, is now in the shipyards being built. They've got just a tremendous fleet that they're putting out there for what we call blue water operations or operations far from land. Russia's investing in advanced aircraft and tanks. So it's a world that's serious about securing their interests in their region and reaching out further, and it makes problematic what we've been trying to do. So to my good friend, David Shedd.
Thank you, and a good morning to all of you. I am delighted to be here. Let's start with the definition of intelligence. Intelligence is essentially the information that creates a decision advantage for a decision maker, be it the president, the national security team, General and Secretary Mattis, as an example, the war fighter out in the combat areas, or the police chief on terrorism on the domestic side, are great examples of that decision advantage. Where is the tension? The tension is bureaucracies will choose failure over change every time. Why is that? Because against the world that Dakota just described you in the defense elements of our nation, the same applies inside the intelligence community of 16 organizations, where they look in a rearview mirror and have the propensity to do things as they used to do them, believing that will define success into the future. Whereas we know that President Trump and the national security team today face challenges very different to those that I faced in 1982 when I joined CIA. A bipolar world has gone into a multipolar world with challenges from both nation states and non-state actors, as we know, with Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and other players that are out there. So let me give you, and by the way, I'm not using slides because I would have had to classify them. I'm just saying that I skipped the PowerPoint. But what I want to hear from you are your questions against the various challenges that we have geographically or with the transnational issues. But I thought I'd give you a sense or context of where those challenges are. First, recruiting the personnel into the intelligence community is absolutely vital. We talked about an investment of 2.5 years or so to build up that battalion. We're looking at 5 to 7 years before an intelligence officer actually becomes proficient in the business of intelligence. So it takes an investment in those people. That really fell down during the 8 years of the Obama administration. There wasn't the recruiting and there wasn't the retention in the intelligence community, and that has to be reversed. And since I thought it might be useful for you to put a letter grade to it, I believe in that area I would give the nation a C in terms of what President Trump inherited from the previous administration by way of finding and retaining the talent that we need for the intelligence business of our nation. Second, technology. The technology that our nation is thriving upon in the private sector must be brought into the public sector, and specifically, in my case, the intelligence community. When you think about artificial intelligence, when you think of machine learning, the world of data that we're residing in terms of defining our own future as to where the information resides to give that decision advantage. That investment in technology brought into the intelligence community has also failed to materialize in the way that I believe it needs to. And once again, for the past 8 years, excluding the last 15 months or so, I would give it a C. And the last thing, and it's related to the first two, is changing the paradigm that would then bring the private-public sector partnerships much, much more closer together. We were very, very damaged by the Edward Snowden case, in where we have a number of companies that are very reluctant today to work with us in terms of supporting our intelligence requirements when it comes to technology and other forms of support. That, however, should not result in us giving up on trying to bring that public-private partnership much closer together. 20, 25 years ago, 30-plus years ago, when I joined the intelligence community, the intelligence organizations like CIA, DIA, the National Security Agency, and others all had the comparative advantage by developing highly classified technologies inside government. That today is completely reversed. That is, the private sector has that advantage, and that is in fact what has to be brought in. So what are some of the challenges that we face on the global map? The first I would tell you is the monetized value of technology has gotten so low that the entry point for our adversaries is dramatically increased. What do I mean by that? The ability of someone with relatively small resources can go buy unmanned aerial vehicles, such as the Predators, and use them for terrible, terrible things. With a relatively low amount of resource, our adversaries, again, nation states as well as non-state actors, can get into the cyber domains, as we have seen, and cause enormous damage. In other words, the cost of entry for our adversaries has dropped dramatically, and that's what we need to respond to. Secondly, there is a full-out assault on the international order by Russia and China, among others. That is, the rules of engagement, if I can use that terminology, of how they get involved and what they will challenge us on is not constrained by what we have accepted for the last 70 years in a post-World War II world as being acceptable behavior. Where's a manifestation of that? Crimea, Eastern Ukraine, the Baltics in the case of the cyber assaults by Russia with little green men. In the South China Sea, you see it in terms of the buildup by Xi Jinping and the Middle Kingdom in terms of its ascendancy to a global power aspirations, while not there yet, certainly aspirational to be there. Iran largely unconstrained in the Middle East until the last 15, 18 months in terms of responding to them and counterbalancing the Iran nuclear deal. So you see the challenges in the world and why this pillar of intelligence, which is to prevent the war at all costs by having that decisive advantage, or should you be at war or in conflict, win it decisively? That is the definition of the value of intelligence. And lastly, the reliance on our friends and partners. In a world that is increasingly global, the reliance of the comparative advantage that Israel brings in not a bad neighborhood, an awful neighborhood, is unmeasurable by way of our partnership with Israel, as an example. Our partnership with Japan and helping them build their intelligence capabilities, be it against the North Korea challenges that we have or China itself, are absolutely vital. The investment that we make in Mexico to counter the transnational criminal organizations that bring the havoc into our nation as well as into Mexico, and that comes up through the Central American countries there, is a good investment for the United States. In other words, in a world more complex by way of our national security challenges, a demand for increased intelligence, I would argue that third pillar of relying on friends and partners is actually on the increase, and we need to deepen those ties rather than somehow isolate ourselves thinking that we can do this all alone. And so with that, rather than going and describing each and every country and where those challenges are, I was going to leave that to the Q&A time.
Perfect. Yeah.
And I will gladly answer questions. There are no stupid questions, and there is no classified question. There's only a classified answer, but I know where that line is. How's that for a good arrangement?
And hopefully we won't give a stupid answer.
That is true too, Luke, so thank you.
All right. Thank you both, Dakota and David. Dakota, you really did a good job framing the challenge that we have as a nation, especially for our policymakers to determine what our national priorities are and how to best balance those, especially when it comes to defense. And David, I really liked your comparison between the challenges that you faced in the 80s compared to the challenges today, a bipolar world versus a multipolar world. And I like to say that if you took a diplomat from 1870 and a diplomat from 1970 and had both of them cryogenically frozen, and you thawed both of them out today, it would be the one from 1870 that would most recognize the world and the challenges that we face today, not the one from 1970. So we have about 20 minutes or so for Q&A. I'm sure that something that was said sparked some sort of discussion. We have a microphone. The lady here, yes?
Hi, I'm Lane from Boca Grande. The Wall Street Journal wrote an article about 2 months ago with a big picture of Xi Jinping on it, and it talked about how we're in our Sputnik moment with regards to competing with them on artificial intelligence. They said that they have supercomputers now 10 times faster than our fastest. They said we can't fly our airplanes without Chinese chips. They also talked about how high-tech exports went in China over the course of 2 decades from 5% to 25%. U.S. chart was reversed from that. And they also wrote a different article on North Korean hackers and how they used to be considered second-rate, and they're now have won places 1, 2, and 3 on the world stage in recent competitions. So can you speak to those points? Thank you.
Yes, they didn't do very well in hockey, but boy, in hacking, they do pretty good. So the Defense Department is aware of all the issues that you've talked about. It comes down to the incentives for either spending money where it needs to be spent or avoiding the allure of ever greater efficiencies. We would all want to be as efficient as possible in spending a taxpayer dollar. So by way of example, the efficiency drives decisions that take the services from having, say, 4 different types of fighter airplanes down to 1. If I have 1 type, it simplifies training, it simplifies my parts block, it simplifies the facilities I need to have. You know, I can get more return on the dollar by cost averaging over a single type of airplane so that the unit cost is less. I mean, that makes perfect sense, right? What that does is it introduces a vulnerability that if that one answer turns out to have a flaw in some way, my entire capability set has been compromised. So it's actually a strategic investment to have perhaps a less efficient but more effective system where I have redundancies built in. Now, why did I use that as an example? When you look at resourcing things from other markets, if I can buy a computer chip more cheaply and it lowers the per unit cost by getting it from China, well, my parts suppliers are going to go down that path because we're trying to squeeze greater efficiencies out of the system that we have. So when administrations, Clinton administration, even the George W. Bush administration, and certainly the Obama administration, when you take your eye off of that ball, don't be surprised if we find ourselves dependent from this drive on efficiencies and not wanting to spend more of our own money on things, where we're dependent on other suppliers. Rocket engines from Russia. We don't produce any kind of booster engines. We buy all of them from Russia. Chipsets from China. Rare earth metals that are critical to making things like computer chips and whatnot. China has an almost exclusive monopoly because it's not cost effective to mine and produce our own resources here in the United States. So there is this national security component where it costs more to do things here at home, but you have a greater strategic advantage if you decide to make that investment. So they're aware of that. Authoritarian regimes like in Beijing and Moscow can direct resources far more quickly than we can. So if the Chinese government decides to spend $1 billion on an AI industrial park or development center in a single location, one of many, they can make those decisions. State-owned enterprises, the blending of government use and civilian use is rampant across some of these other countries. That's not our model, but our model is more expensive. Are we willing to fund that type of model? And that's really, I think, the question we have today.
So only 2 additional points to Dakota's. The 650% increase in investment in defense has been matched on intelligence by the Chinese intelligence services, both civilian and military. And to that end, they are determined to, as we've seen through their hacking efforts, to leapfrog, if you will, the investment in the research and development to take our intellectual property rights and all the rest and the investment that we've done in R&D and apply it to a much more robust funding and human resource aspects of it. We have stayed in the intelligence community, this is very important for you to know, somewhere between 10 and 12% at a steady rate in investment on intelligence to the total defense budget. So if 600 billion is the number to 700 billion, it is about 60 to 70 billion invested, and that's a very steady state in the United States. And we have to ask ourselves, is that right? On North Korea, here's the mistake we make. Hermit Kingdom can't possibly know how to do these sorts of things. Where they have chosen to invest their capabilities and focus, as we've seen with their intercontinental ballistic missile program, as we've seen with their nuclear testing and that, along with the hacking, they are first rate. Do not underestimate them. And I think there's one Hollywood studio that doesn't anymore. So it's just, this is a mistake that we make as Americans. They can't possibly be doing the sorts of things because they're not really very smart and educated. It depends where they put their resources. And as Dakota said, in an authoritarian state or a totalitarian state as Pyongyang in North Korea is, you can make those decisions alone.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm going to, just while you're getting the next question, I'm going to bring up another slide just for context. And it's not quite showing up. There you go. Those are just reference marks. It shows those arrows on the left side blue over the last 30 years, okay, but remember 10 of those are the 90s during the Clinton administration, and spending was down well below 3%, about 2.5%.
The peace dividend, by the way.
The peace dividend.
The infamous peace dividend.
That puts you at 4% of GDP on defense spending. During the Cold War, you know, again, global, lots of things going on, we were above 6% of GDP. So if you've got an $18 trillion economy, 5% is $900 billion. 6% is going to be around $1.2 trillion. On historical averages from Korea War up to the end of the Cold War, that's roughly what you'd be spending. But we've become so used to these reduced budgets across Intel, research and development, artificial, these other things, that the levels for spending now, which seem to be very big, are actually low relative to global interest for the United States as a global power. And I think the public just doesn't understand the scale, right, that we have dropped over a quarter of a century, and then what it takes to get back to where you actually want to be.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I read an article several years ago about some new platforms that were coming online for defense, such as micro drones and so forth. And has the Trump administration been supporting these new platforms, and how much do you think they'll play a factor in our defense in the next 10 or 20 years, just platforms that we barely even have now?
Yeah, real quickly, I mean, it's a great point on that, in that we have always leveraged technology to make up for a disadvantage in capacity. So in the old Cold War, Soviet Union troops, they were just going to outnumber NATO forces. But we had better equipment. So the bet was, in that theater, you could kill or shoot more of their folks and platforms than what they would be able to do to us. And so it was kind of a balancing act there. The idea of micro-miniaturized drones, larger unmanned systems, primarily in the air, but increasing on the ground and undersea. What the Defense Department would say is, I've got this multi-mission destroyer. It is better than any other ship on the ocean. And so it's a technological advantage. The problem with that is that destroyer can only be in one place at one time, right? And if I lose it and I don't have very many of them, it represents a greater percentage of my combat power, right? So no platform is impervious to attack. So where we're at is fairly expensive, multi-purpose types of things, few of them because of these budget numbers, right? And so in an actual war where you're going to have combat losses, you can see your combat power eroding very quickly, and a very difficult time replacing that because of the time that it takes to replace these things. So the high-tech aspect, knowing where the enemy is more accurately, being able to direct resources more quickly, which is where your artificial intelligence capabilities come in to better assess what's going on and more effectively apply guided munitions against a particular target. All that is good. And the services are pursuing them with the DIUX, which connects, it's a program to connect the Defense Department with intellectual capacity in the civilian markets. transformation initiatives to try to put more money into R&D to develop and harness these emerging technologies, and what does it really mean? All that is good. Where there is a huge shortfall is taking the ideas and having the capacity across the force to go into a training environment and actually experiment with them and see what actually works in the real world. So I can have an idea that something might be revolutionary, but until I prove that in an operational setting, I don't really know. And that's the shortfall because of these budget challenges. I got to pay for current operations. I've got reconstitution costs that are coming down the pike, so where do I take risk? And it's a lot of this experimentation and figuring out what all the new stuff means.
So as the Intel guy with the black hat on and the glass half empty, I have to tell you that's exactly what our adversaries are doing today. So the challenges that Dakota poses by way of the offensive capabilities of our armed services need to be protected from what our adversaries are doing by way of micro drones and other forms that's that cost, the barriers to cost of entry are so low that they're doing that as well.
Sir.
I've read a couple articles that said one of the defense problems is there's been too much money spent on overhead and a lot less on troops. Dakota, perhaps you could address that situation, and in fact, is that the case?
Yes, sir. You know, the services, they're painfully aware of the material readiness of their forces. So if they can squeeze a nickel out of bureaucratic costs, they're trying to do that. No enterprise is perfectly efficient. You can always find savings someplace. Those of you that run businesses know that if you retool, there's an upfront cost to doing that. It disrupts workflow. Everybody has to kind of find a new area. So where you stand down something and stand up a new organization, combine activities, let's say I've got installation maintenance along the entirety of the East Coast, it's going to take a while to combine the processes and the paperwork and, you know, how do I allocate dollars across 10 installations instead of doing 10 separate things. So there are efficiencies to be gained from that, but an upfront cost to do it. You know, it costs a lot of money to close down a base when we have, say, a BRAC round, a base realignment and closure. Upfront costs, but that will generate savings over 10 or 20 or 30 years, right? So they're aware of that. They look for it. There is a real-world challenge of dealing with the inherent bureaucratic structures where once a civil service billet is established, you know, how do I fire somebody or change them? And I think a comment on an earlier panel, might have been yesterday, talked to that, the ability to actually fire federal employees, you know, when they're not performing how they should, and what are my metrics for assessing that. But it's problematic. Part of that is driven by congressional oversight desires. If Congress wants a report on how production of the B-21 Raider bomber is going, well, who's going to produce the report? You know, so I've got some bureaucratic requirements to provide oversight, auditing, report generation, reporting back to various entities, and that's a layer of bureaucracy. If you could invest more accountability and responsibility in the services themselves and less in the reporting requirements, which implies trust, I think that you could reduce more of that bureaucratic overhead. So they're aware of them. It's a challenge to improve because you do get kind of this marginal return, you know, on any things, and usually there's an upfront cost, which in a budget-constrained environment is kind of hard to justify in the near term when you've got so many other things you have to be spending money on.
Yes, sir.
Yes. Three just quick strains of thought. How accurate are those OMB budget projections? We hear about OMB all the time. I want to hear some retrospective data on that. Two, when it comes to allocating money within a budget, a military budget, I go from my own impression, it's better not to bring a knife to a gunfight kind of concept. In other words, my emphasis would be on the technology. I know you need it for the manpower and various other things, but is it more currently biased towards improving our intelligence? And as far as capability, you know, just because you have 20 or 1,000 this or that, if you have one or two great minds, all of a sudden you go a quantum leap in technology. And the third thing that I just forgot what I was going to say, but I'll get to it if I get another shot around.
Thank you.
reminds me of Rick Perry, right? Didn't he have like 5 things he was going to close? So do you want to address the middle one?
Yeah, but go ahead.
Okay. So I think the first point was, I was going to write this down. OMB, thank you. Yeah, so all of these forecasts are based on assumptions made up front. So what is the projection of reducing taxes with this big tax cut that actually generate additional wealth across the economy? That's an estimate. What is my guess on inflation? Does it stay low, or do we start to see an inflationary spiral? There was an article I was reading yesterday about conditions today being eerily similar to what existed in 1928-29, right? So this forecasting into the future, what OMB typically does, and even the Congressional Budget Office, usually they're less optimistic in terms of growth, more pessimistic, which I think is probably more realistic on real-world costs. Wonderful study done by the Army History Division on something like 50 years worth of defense reform initiatives, trying to make acquisition more effective, more cost effective. And what they found was the incentive structures are always wrong. Initial projections are always underestimate the challenges, and that the costs are always, for major acquisition, 2 to 3 times more than what was estimated. It takes 15 years to go from idea to a fielded capability, and the final capability you get is always less than what was hoped for, right? So those are realities, and I think some of these estimates take that into account, right? So the entering assumptions on growth rates, on inflation, really drive these understandings of what these debt loads will be. And I think the debt will be larger than what most people are estimating. That I don't know. I mean, I'm just not well versed on that. Yeah. I do know that colleagues at Heritage who actually look at that have said that OMB projections are usually not worth the paper they're written on. I mean, that it's been pretty bad because of these entering assumptions.
Okay. And David?
To the second question, I would argue that it's a combination between the investment in people and getting the balance right with technology. I have 2 big concerns in the technological field. One is the advent of quantum computing. That will not be a straight line of upgrading your iPhone to an iPhone 15 as opposed to the iPhone X. It will be literally a quantum leap well beyond anything we know as computing, and puts in jeopardy all encryption. And the Chinese are at the forefront in that area. The second one, and it's somewhat interrelated to quantum computing, is the war in space. And I don't mean the parking lot. This is in space, the ability of the Russians, Chinese to take out our GPS and all our communication lines that are satellite-based, in which they are investing enormous amount of effort to do that. You need the personnel that are trained to address that in the ground stations and all the rest. But our ability to protect those satellites is going to be technological as well, in terms of identifying the threat and responding to it from a technological one. And this is where that private-public partnership is so vital to the intelligence community, much as it is for the defense resources.
Thank you. For sake of time, unfortunately, we have time for one last question. The gentleman over here, please.
Thank you. Larry Blanford from Naples. Certainly, we're all aware of the increasing issues with aggressiveness of Russia and China and Crimea, and we've let Russians get back in Syria and so on and so forth. I'm concerned. I would like your comments. You mentioned a little bit when you mentioned Mexico, but our own hemisphere, Latin America, what's going on in Venezuela, the soft underbelly of our own hemisphere, which to me puts us at risk for China or Russia getting involved in our own hemisphere. Thoughts on that, both from an intelligence standpoint and involvement of our military or government in Latin American countries?
David is an expert on this, but I'm going to have to ask that he restricts his answer to about 45 seconds.
Okay. Born in Bolivia, raised as a missionary kid in Latin America, it's my first love by way of a geographic area. I'm deeply concerned about overlooking both the threats but also the opportunities in the Western Hemisphere. Venezuela today, to give you just a sense of where it is under Maduro, which was inherited from Chavez, is a country with 13,000% inflation rate, of where the likelihood of a birth leading to a sound birth is better in Syria than it is in Venezuela. The Isthmus of Central America is a pipeline of organized crime up through Mexico. We need to counter that, as we've done with the strategy on counterterrorism, by taking it all the way down to Panama and up through Honduras, El Salvador, and Nicaragua, Guatemala, as in terms of stopping that flow of criminality and giving them the rule of law and capabilities around it. We need to do that in partnership with the Argentines, the Chileans, the Colombians, and others there. Brazil will bottom out soon, I think. That sleeping giant may wake up someday, but it's a real economy. And I think you're absolutely right in the emphasis of your question to be looking into the Western Hemisphere and investing in it in ways. The Chinese and the Russians see enormous potential there, both for doing bad stuff for us, but also simply because natural resources are there, particularly for China, that we ought to be countering.
Thank you, David. And that concludes this panel discussion. Thank you for your wonderful questions. I hope there's some food for thought for everyone here. Thanks to our panelists, David and Dakota.